Greg and Matt. All right, so welcome everybody to the Scholars Forum in the Catholic Intellectual Tradition. This is our second event of the academic year. The forum consists of faculty talking about their recently published or soon to be published books. This one is recently published, related in one way or another to the Catholic intellectual tradition, and it takes place on Teams, usually on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. The forum is sponsored by the University Core, the Catholic Studies Program, the Catholic Studies Center, and Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology. It's an exciting expression of harvesting our treasures, and our faculty scholars truly are among those treasures. Jesuit philosopher Bernard Lonergan said, "A university is a reproductive organ of cultural community. Its constitutive endowment lies not in buildings or equipment, civil status or revenues, but in the intellectual life of its professors." That quote by Lonergan, by the way, comes from Casey Choi, who, when we first planned this whole venture, he thought that was an important quote, and he contributed that to the introduction. And so that's what we're celebrating here, our faculty treasures. For this, our second talk for the fall semester, we're very pleased to have as our speaker Dr. Donovan Sherman, Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the English Department, who will be presenting on his recent book, The Philosopher's Toothache, Embodied Stoicism in Early Modern English Drama. I love that title. Dr. Sherman's first book, Second Death, Theatricalities of the Soul in Shakespeare's Drama, was published as part of the Edinburgh Critical Studies in Shakespeare and Philosophy from Edinburgh University Press in 2016. He is going to be introduced by another English professor. This is a real English professor event connected with our other disciplines. Dr. Elizabeth Redwine, who is also our coordinator of the Core 1, and also a past presenter for the Scholars Forum. There will also be time for questions and answers at the end of the session, and Maribel Andrau, Assistant Director of the Core, will coordinate the questions, which can be given verbally or by raising a hand in the chat. So I'm now very happy to turn it over to Dr. Redwine for the introduction.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And I just emailed the link again, just because I saw Gloria. I mean, it was right there. I don't know why I couldn't see it, but then in case anyone else is having like a Wednesday that feels like a Monday, and so I just emailed it one more time. So I'm so grateful to Donovan as a colleague and friend and fellow writer. And as he knows, because I put it in the foreword to my book, I would not have finished my 2021 book without Donovan's support. And he's just one of those people. Like, I remember when I got one of the returns, the revise and resubmits, and I'll never forget it. They said, "It's all great except for the epilogue." And Donovan had the great line of, I just told one of my students today, because they're struggling with their conclusion, that's like liking the meal but complaining about the garnish. And I'm like, oh, that made me feel so much better about the process of revision. So thank you, Donovan, for keeping me going in my scholarship and writing. I really appreciate the support over the years. And then I was emailing to Nancy that I listened to this New Books in History podcast, which I recommend. It's just when you can't listen to anything political anymore and you just kind of, I mean, you know, you want the big view or the long view. I love this podcast. And so imagine my happy surprise to see Donovan on the podcast talking about his book. And then I just have to say, echo what Nancy said about the titles. Like, I really struggle with titles, and I actually will often turn to Donovan and say, like, okay, help me decide on a title. Like, help me with the titles. And I love the Philosopher's Toothbrush as a title. So very grateful to you, Donovan, for the years of support as a fellow writer. And yes, honestly, couldn't have finished that. You know how brutal that process. We all know the revision, how hard it is. So I'm very grateful to you and really excited to hear about this book. And I loved listening to the podcast. So I might have to share the podcast with everyone as well. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to hearing your discussion today.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Nancy, for inviting me, and all of you for being here. So as Elizabeth mentioned and Nancy mentioned, my book, The Philosopher's Toothache, I've got it right here, is about the revival of Stoicism in the early modern era, or what some of us might call the Renaissance. particularly in how it's made manifest in the drama of the period. And what I'm going to do today is read from the book, a little bit from the introduction, and then move on to a chapter that's sort of a case study of how that might be applied. In particular, when I get to the chapter, which is about a much forgotten, and in some ways rightfully so, early modern play called The Atheist Tragedy, I'm going to talk less about that particular play because I know that's not something that all of us might have read, but instead about my sort of reading of a Catholic and Christian engagement with Stoicism in the early modern era and beyond, which I think would be applicable for this group and for the theme of this wonderful forum. So if it's all right, I'd like to share a presentation. So do I have presentation or presenter powers? Nancy, do you know? I think if you just,
I can
oh.
give you that. Yeah,
Oh, great, thank you.
how do I do that though? I've done it.
Nancy,
but-
they just told me this morning at our committee meeting. Click on the people icon,
Okay.
and next to Donovan's name, you should see, if you scroll over it, there'll be 3 dots. And then if you click on those, you can click Make Presenter.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg.
No problem.
Thank you.
Great, there we are. So excellent. I'm going to share, and really this is very bare bones. I just have a few passages that maybe we could look at and think about so that you can linger on it and read it on your own as I speak. I begin with an epigraph for my book, which is from Seneca's Letter on Ethics, and it reads, "Philosophy teaches us to act, not to speak." Seneca offers this dictum as a form of consolation to his friend and pupil Lucilius, the addressee of the philosopher's Letters on Ethics. This particular letter begins with exasperation. "For it will be to my credit," Seneca claims, "if I manage to extricate you from that place where you are now floundering without any hope of escape." Lucilius is struggling. He's in a bad place. And Seneca's advice is to focus on action, not speeches. As he does throughout his correspondence, Seneca expresses distaste for his over-reliance on words, the very medium of his expression. It is in actions, he insists, that philosophy resides. And only by living, rather than simply expounding on philosophy, can one calm the paralyzing anxiety that Lucilius feels. But how does one live a philosophy? The question is central to Stoicism, the school for which Seneca is a standard bearer. The major classical Stoic texts that have survived, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and then some fragments that we have from here and there from ancient Greek Stoicism, all evince a belief that philosophy resides in active and embodied habits and decisions rather than in spoken or written words. The actual goal of Stoicism can be stated simply: to operate by reason alone through the extirpation of the passions, thereby living in complete accordance with nature. What complicates the matter is the how, not the what. The telos of pure reason is so nearly impossible that one needed a radical revision of their entire disposition in order to attempt its attainment. It is in this process of revision that Stoicism thrives, in the actions, cogitations, habits, and decisions by which one focuses on the North Star of the Stoic ideal. As the philosopher Pierre Hadot, who is sort of my North Star for much of this project, memorably terms it, Stoicism is less a doctrinal system and more a, quote, way of life. And that comes from his very influential book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. Hadot's influential claim that classical philosophy resides in the particularities of one's everyday behavior rather than in a static intellectual and textual expression of ideas encompasses more schools of thought than Stoicism. But for Hadot, Stoicism most vividly realizes the goal of a philosophical life. For the ancients, he says, but particularly for the Stoics, philosophy was a way of life rather than a cerebral exercise. Why Stoicism? And here I can talk about this in the Q&A. I'm going to skip a little bit. I compare Stoicism to other classical philosophies like Cynicism or Epicureanism. But essentially, Stoicism, as Hadot and others hold it, revels in the immediate materiality of one's surroundings. Rejecting a model of hierarchy, of knowledge, and of levels of reality, the Stoic instead celebrates the representation of an organic unity in which there is complete co-penetration. As a result, the distinction between physics as a science of the sensible world and a science of the transcendent world of ideas, that is, think Plato, or of the gods, is completely abolished. In other words, Stoicism celebrates a kind of vibrant materiality of the world. And as I'm going to talk about later, that became a point of engagement and also contention with theories of the incarnation and with creation in the early modern era in which Christianity became a kind of dominant theological framework. Okay, so Stoicism situates itself entirely in practice, and that practice trains the philosopher's eye to remain vigilant and attentive to every detail of the world around them, not a world in a heavenly beyond, nor one hermetically set off from society, but the precise same world in which we live, in all of its seemingly uneventful happenings. And here's a quote, I think, from Ado that I think really captures this idea. He says, quote, "The philosophical idea is not situated merely on the cognitive level, but on that of the self and of being. It is a progress which causes us to be more fully and makes us more fully and makes us better. It is a conversion which turns our entire life upside down, changing the life of the person who goes through it. It raises the individual from an inauthentic condition of life, darkened by unconsciousness and harassed by worry, to an authentic state of life in which he attains self-consciousness, an exact vision of the world, inner peace, and freedom." So, sounds easy enough, right? We can all just attain complete freedom and peace. Of course, it's very difficult, and Stoicism thus resides in the exercises by which we must try to attain that ideal, the ideal that is really never reached. Seneca said that only Cato ever truly reached the idea of the true sagehood as a Stoic sage. So we can deduce from Ado's account of Stoicism that it bears striking affinities with a medium often placed in opposition to philosophy, the theater. Like the theater, Stoicism utilizes the vessel of the human body as its primary instrument. Similarly, Stoicism asks that we remain, quote, in the moment, responsive, reactive, attentive to every shift in the energy of a scene. And Stoicism, like theater, needs an audience, a public body scrutinizing and reacting to a performer's actions to provide immediate feedback and accountability. And yet Stoicism does not conform to a traditional view of mimesis. Again, contra Platonism, the Stoic's behavior does not view action as mimetic of something abstract, but instead as the sum totality of its immediately observable phenomena. The Stoic does not possess what the theater scholar Martin Puchner deems the most fundamental tenets of what is usually called Platonism, a disregard of the concrete, embodied, lived experience, and a desire instead to ascend to some realm of abstract forms or ideas, pure and simple. In other words, Stoicism was not transcendent. It did not believe in a world beyond the materiality around us. It just thought that the materiality and the immediacy of that world had a special kind of spiritual power, right? And so you can see what I'm kind of teeing up here is that Stoics were often received by Christian thinkers as simultaneously somehow both heretical in their materialism and almost a kind of proto understanding of a form of divinity that can be found in the everyday and in the world around us. Indeed, the Stoics needed to train their energy almost entirely on the ability to discern what is real or what is false. But this attention is focused inward at the mental representations of reality ushered into cognition by perception. This does, as an aside, recall Seneca's sort of famous moment, aphorism in his letters on ethics, where he says that what is virtue? Virtue is judgment. And what he means by that is that we have to judge the thoughts and the representations of reality that arise in our consciousness and determine whether they arise from reason or whether they are from the passions, and they are thus, quote, things indifferent, or adiaphora is the term. As Martha Nussbaum explains, Stoicism instructs the philosopher to, quote, suspend her habitual responses and turn her gaze upon herself, becoming watchful and critical of each impression that she is inclined to accept. It is within the mind that theater's traditionally mimetic powers can be ascertained on the stage of consciousness. I'm going to skip a little bit here to talk somewhat about how Stoicism then found itself in the early modern era. I can talk more about that in the Q&A again, but essentially But here, by the way, is a quote, sorry, I'm a little behind in the slides here, in which Marcus Aurelius demonstrates this kind of inward self-questioning. Am I accomplishing some action? I accomplish it relating it to the well-being of mankind. Is something happening to me? I greet it, relating what happens to me to the gods and to the source of all things, whence is formed the framework of events. And this, I think, is indicative of Marcus's ability that Ado reads as very much a precursor to the kind of spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And I'd be very curious to hear from my much more theologically adept audience today about how they might feel this resonates with spiritual exercises in the Catholic intellectual tradition. And here's another wonderful quote about how Stoicism harmonizes in surprising ways with the theater and with performance. This is Epictetus from his handbook. He says, quote, remember that thou art an actor in a play of such a kind as the teacher may choose, if short, of a short one, if long, of a long one. And Epictetus wrote this in his handbook. Marcus wrote that other meditation in his meditations, and both of those served as texts that were to be read and reread and reread and reread every day as a kind of prompt for one's own spiritual development, right? It's a genre that we don't really have in a lot of present day, at least popular literature, which is the Enchiridion, the handbook, that which is kept at hand, that we read to kind of remind us of certain moral lessons. And here I had to include this. This is where I got the title of my book. I kind of go on in this chapter to talk about how when Stoicism was revived in the Renaissance, it was the sort of stock Stoic character was this kind of killjoy guy who was a hermit and didn't understand any his feelings. Think of I give some examples here of Justice Overdue in a play by Ben Jonson, as well as perhaps the most famous Stoic, Horatio in Hamlet, who is wonderful, but as Hamlet says, there's more to heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy. This is a quote from Much Ado About Nothing, where Leonardo is a father figure who believes that his daughter has passed away, and he wants to mourn his daughter, and someone attempts to console him, and he says, quote, I pray thee peace, I will be flesh and blood, for there was never yet philosopher that could endure the toothache patiently. However, they have writ the styles of gods and make a push at chance and sufferance. And then I sort of contrast that with a wonderful speech from Hamlet. In other words, let me just briefly linger on that Leonardo quote from Much Ado. Essentially, he's saying, philosophy can only get you so far. Once they have a toothache, their philosophy crumbles. What about my body? What about my feelings, my lived experience? And so what I'm sort of pointing out is there's this missed understanding of classical philosophy, which was all about cultivating habits and physicality and attitudes towards the world. And suddenly it became revived as almost its opposite, as this very cognitive, doctrinal, intellectual set of beliefs utterly cut off from the physical and embodied world, right? So part of what my book does is try to trace that story. How did this happen? And here's a quote that I think in some ways, despite itself, realizes a lot of Stoic goals. This is from Shakespeare's Hamlet. It's a famous speech in which Hamlet is instructing the players, i.e. the actors that he meets, how to put on a play. And he says, be not too tame neither, but let your own discretion be your tutor. Suit the action to the word to the action, with this special observance that you o'erstep not the modesty of nature. For anything so o'erdone is from the purpose of playing, whose end, both at the first and now, was and is to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time his form and pressure. And what I point out is, even though Hamlet scorns philosophy, I think he's actually proposing something very philosophical here, which is a kind of way of performing in which you are trying to make sure you are living in accordance to nature here, or virtue, right? And so he's sort of inadvertently a Stoic, even though he spurns Stoicism when it is actually named in the play. Okay, ooh, this is a little teaser for where I'm going to go. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. But to conclude this first part of the talk, which is about the understanding of Stoicism as performance, I say I'm going to pick up back in the book. Thinking of Stoicism as performance helps solve a potential problem with the claim that Stoicism bears affinities to the theater. It is more accurate, perhaps, to say that Stoicism mobilizes a theatrical vocabulary in its exercises. The actual activity of Stoic ascesis, or which is to say exercise, does not make for riveting action. Marcus Aurelius, sitting at his study, closing his eyes and visualizing his day, does not arrest an audience's attention. Rather, while the Stoic exercise is not itself theater, it renders life theatrical. The critical generosity of performance studies, which is a discipline that thinks through performance outside of the theater, the performance of everyday life, finds a classical antecedent in Stoicism exhortation to imagine the world as irreducibly material, but nonetheless, or perhaps especially, deserving of intense study and prompt for reflection. Okay, so now I'm going to skip to another chapter on, again, this play, The Atheist Tragedy, that you need not be too concerned about. But what I'd like to, I'm going to kind of slalom around that play and instead talk a little bit about the kind of Christian tradition and reception of Stoicism in Shakespeare's day and even beforehand, most perhaps saliently in the work of St. Augustine. Okay, so this is from my chapter 4. In Christian thought, Stoic belief could either shade into non-belief or provide a classical blueprint for proper worship. And I sort of take here this passage here from Acts 17, which I'll now sort of read more closely. The amorphous, neither apostasy nor doctrinal quality of Stoicism finds its signal demonstration in the Stoics' appearance in the New Testament. In Acts 17, Paul travels to Athens, where he is met by some local philosophers who demand that he defend his faith. Here's the quote. Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans, of the Stoics, encountered him. And some said, what will this babbler say? I'm taking this from the King James version, which would be the version, that or the Geneva Bible, that Shakespeare would use, or people would use in his time. And I know that certainly to some of my colleagues in the seminary who I've taught with before, using the King James prompts some raised eyebrows, which is fine, but I want to be historically accurate here. What will this babbler say? Others some, he seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new doctrine whereof you speakest is? Paul proceeds to give a speech on Mars Hill that explains what he sees as the fundamental innovations of his religion, but does so with a nod to local tradition. He begins by observing that in Athens he noticed, quote, an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, which he takes as a marker of the worshippers being, quote, too superstitious. Rather than believe in a faraway unknown deity, one whose existence is taken on delusion and who sustains himself on prayer, Paul advocates for a God free from any particular place, one who, quote, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, and who through grace instead resides in life itself, quote, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all thing. In explaining that, quote, in him we live and move and have our being, Paul draws on the words of a local writer to help weave his beliefs into those of his audience. He says, as certain also of your poets have said, for we are all also his offspring. The local poet in question is Aratus, a Stoic, and this brief passage from his in the Areopagus sermon appears in his only surviving work, The Phenomena. But the words cited by the apostle are not a central part of Aratus's poem, which primarily deals with the weather. Instead, they appear in the very beginning as a preliminary incantation that divinely authorizes the natural theories that follow. This is Aratus. From Zeus let us begin. Him do we mortals never leave unnamed. From full of Zeus are all the streets and all the marketplaces of men. Full is the sea and the havens thereof. Always we have need, all we have need of Zeus. For we are also his offspring, and he in his kindness unto men giveth favorable signs and wakeneth the people to work, reminding them of their livelihood. It is only because God created the world, asserts Aratus, that it can be legible to us and worthy of study. Furthermore, prayer serves as a way to affirm the divine connection between humans and the heavens. Paul marshals these words to a markedly different effect, imbuing them with a sense of urgency as he warns his audience of the oncoming judgment that awaits them when Jesus returns. He also implicitly yokes Aratus's Stoic cosmology to the Christian doctrine of creation, as both believe in the miraculous coexistence of the divine and the physical. Aratus's doxology reads in this sense as a pagan version of the first chapter of the Gospel of John, which itself knowingly rehearses the opening lines of Genesis with the addition of the typological knowledge of Jesus' birth. Before Jesus' arrival on earth, the narrator of John asserts God, quote, was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. Aratus' praise is less grandiose, but similarly finds Zeus not an unknown god outside the world, but all around, in the streets and the marketplaces. Because he created us, we can locate his signs in nature. I'm going to skip a little bit more here to bring in a particular Catholic theological notion of belief. And the part that I'm skipping here kind of examines atheism as it existed in Shakespeare's time. And I should note here that the term atheism was strangely flexible. You might think there's a pretty straightforward definition of atheism, but in perhaps its most infamous example, Milton refers to the demons in Paradise Lost as the gang of atheists, which is a very funny thing to call people or demons who literally fought against God. I think they can believe in God. It's just that atheism in that instance names a kind of lack of belief or a lack of faith. Okay, so in this chapter, I have identified how Stoic physics proposes a model of embodiment that, seen one way, anticipates Christian incarnation, but seen another, denies the philosopher an understanding of the transcendence of a Christian God. At stake in this distinction is how we comprehend the materiality of the world. Are we to see it as cast within a larger, unknowable plan, an ember with a divine spark? Or is it mere adiaphora, to be dismissed as unnecessary to the more important focus inward, toward the soul's ability to reason? The key here, I believe, is the instantiation of belief, right? I sort of take up this notion of belief as that which can animate the inanimate materialist view of the Stoics and give it a kind of power, right? And in doing that, I drew from the work of Alvin Plantinga, a Catholic theologian, who has long critiqued the misunderstandings that he sees in debates of religions, quote, against science or other fact-based systems. To hold religion accountable for the demands of science, according to Plantinga, is to conduct an overdetermined battle wherein Christianity cannot help but seem foolish and delusional. He proposes what he calls the Aquinas-Calvin model, an understanding of a way of understanding religious belief as the revelation of what is already within the human. He elaborates that, quote, this natural knowledge of God is not arrived at by inference or argument, for example, the famous theistic proofs of natural theology, but in a much more immediate way. The deliverances of the sensus divinitatis are not quick and sotto voce inferences from the circumstances that trigger its operation. It isn't that one beholds the night sky, notes that it is grand, and concludes that there must be such a person as God. An argument like that would be ridiculously weak. It is rather that, upon perception of the night sky or the mountain vista or the tiny flower, these beliefs just arise within us. They are occasioned by the circumstances. They are not conclusions from them. I thought this was such a powerful philosophical intervention that kind of cuts the Gordian knot of this incessant kind of religion versus science dichotomy, which is so often reductive. In this reckoning, if our natural predisposition is to allow recognition of a sense of a greater plan, then the atheist is not necessarily one who simply transfers this sense to something else. That would be idolatry. Or it would be idolatry if it limited itself to a particular material object, such as a golden calf or painted crucifix, or an altar to an unknown god. The performance of religious belief articulated here invites a comparison to the theater, a place that also thrives on and is even constituted by the effective relations of observers. The shared attentiveness of an audience confers authenticity upon the actions framed by a specific physical or conventional set of strictures, a stage or an imagined line demarcating the audience. This belief is not, quote, factual in Plantinga's sense. Theatrical audiences do not demand to know whether performed proceedings might not be real if contradictory evidence arises. If I see Hamlet, I don't think, wait, this can't be real, and here's why. I am, much like the notion of grace that Plantinga writes about, I take on faith and on belief that what I'm seeing is imbued with a certain power and in a way is real if it is not true. Instead, they are invested in through communal orientation and elaborated on in terms of normative adherence. So, to conclude, I want to kind of tie these ideas together in which the notion of the Stoicism received as both sort of atheistic, but also as potentially resonant with a kind of materialist divinity of the incarnation or of creation, is to me, and again, I'm skipping a lot here, but is to me very reminiscent of the way that belief is imbued in the theater and given power. And to that degree, I believe that a presentation of a kind of Stoic or of an atheist on the stage, which is what this play, The Atheist Tragedy, sort of gives us, is complicated because we are in a relationship of grace with the stage. We are in a relationship in which we are conferring belief onto that and making it, in a sense. So this is the conclusion. Belief then connects religious practice to theatrical experience. Both are sets of coded behaviors sustained not by empirical verification, but by the emergence of a sense of allowing for a pre-existing natural inclination to lend credence to phenomena, whether we call this resulting affect wonder or awe or simply attention. This understanding of belief helps square the circle of Stoicism as it relates to atheism. The difference, it seems, is not necessarily whether the object of belief is material or not, so much as what that object evokes in the beholder. The Stoics' resolutely materialist view of the world can become closer to a Christian one if it results from a naturally occurring wonderment at the pieces of the cosmological whole that we witness. If that belief were to turn into an epistemological inquiry, it would transform the Stoic into the skeptical, misanthropic atheist whose stereotype populates the anti-atheist literature of the Renaissance era. The key is that Stoic belief must be, as Plantinga intimates, performed. It must be constituted through the interaction of entities in space and time. Okay, that's the end of the selections that I brought, and hopefully we can sort of weave that into something in the Q&A. I hope that you saw the sort of through line there in that I set up, in which we think through how Stoic thought proposes a challenge, but also I think an opportunity for engagement in locating in it an opportunity for revising a kind of radical faith. So thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Donovan. That was incredibly interesting. And I do have a question, but I'm going to hold my question because I want to let some other people ask first. So, anybody?
I'm trying to look for the hands. Okay, I got my people list. Anyone? Go ahead, Elizabeth.
You're muted, I believe.
I have kind of a writing question. So can you talk to us a little bit about the process of writing this and how you, like, did you find that Shakespeare quote about the philosopher's toothache for early on or later? And I think I said toothbrush early. I think I am definitely feeling like it's a Wednesday. It's a Wednesday that feels like a Monday. Maybe that'll be your second book, will be about the
Exactly,
toothbrush.
that's the sequel, yes. It'll be a trilogy.
But
yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's so many different strands that are so interesting. So I guess I'm just wondering about like the process of writing the book and the title and, you know, because it also feels like one of those books that actually could be a series. Like there's so much. And then there's also like all these other places that it could go. So, I mean, I've now listened to a couple of talks about it, but I need to read it. So maybe you do get into everything, but like the Shakespeare connection and then this idea of performance studies. And I love what you said at the end about grace and the stage is belief. So I also want to hear more about that. So those are my millions of questions, Donovan.
No, that's great. So the writing question first. The process of coming to this book was actually occasioned by, first of all, actually teaching in the honors program here at Seton Hall, where I noticed that the Stoics, I was teaching a medieval colloquium, which is a little outside my wheelhouse, but was really wonderful to do. And I noticed that in early antiquity, writers, maybe most saliently St. Augustine, who I mentioned before, would kind of hold up Stoicism often as almost a kind of such a problematic philosophy. Augustine in The City of God calls Stoics crippled and racked with pain, and he's sort of, you know, mocking is too strong a word, but critiquing this idea that they can reach, you know, a state of faith through reason alone, which the scholastics would, of course, also have a problem with later on. And I thought, could they really be all that bad, the Stoics? And I was having a discussion with a friend who I met at a college reunion and meeting an old professor of mine from when I was an undergraduate. We were going on a hike, and he brought up this beautiful line of Hamlet's where I can't recite it from memory, but he essentially says something to the effect of, that there is much providence in the fall of the sparrow, which is actually taken from Calvin, and is about this notion of special providence. If it is to be now, if it is to be too soon, then it is too soon. If it is later, then it is later. But if it is now, it is now. And he's sort of saying, this is Hamlet sort of saying, like, whatever, I understand that there's a certain fate that I have to suit myself to. And he ends with the words, let be. And we had this whole discussion about this idea of let be and what does that mean. And he introduced me to Pierre Hadot and his writings. And that's where I kind of found this gold mine of, oh my God, yeah, I've gotten Stoicism all wrong. It's actually this very radical way of life. It's not just something you study in a book. And then I found Martha Nussbaum, and then I read a lot of her, and she's a very famous philosopher. I'm sure many of us are familiar with her. And that led me on this journey to sort of ask, where is that understanding of Stoicism in the early modern era? Because every time a Stoic shows up in the Renaissance, they're a joke. And there's this kind of funny moment in a play of Ben Jonson's called Bartholomew Fair, in which this one character thinks of himself as a Stoic, and he ends up he annoys everyone so much that they put him in the stocks in the center of town. So he's, his hands in his head, but he's still saying, like, I'm doing great, I'm happy, I don't care. It's like this total parody of the Stoic saying, I can't control this, so who cares? I don't, whatever, I'll feel pain. People are throwing, fruit at him and mocking him. And then someone says, what's this, a Stoic in the stocks? Has the fool become philosopher? And then I started looking for more examples. And when I found Much Ado About Nothing's example of Leonardo saying there never was a philosopher who could endure the toothache patiently, I thought, oh, that's my title. That's such a great idea that, in my understanding, it's not that the philosopher can't have a toothache, or that the moment you have a toothache, you don't have philosophy anymore. What you should do is have a toothache and start thinking, like, well, how does this make me feel? Oh, I'm really pissed off that I have a toothache. I want to, that's interesting. Huh. And it's sort of like what we would today call mindfulness. The Stoics were sort of advocating a kind of mindfulness where you note what arises in your mind. You don't stop it. There's this great, there are many Stoics who were very aware of that. And actually, of all people, Michel de Montaigne, in his essays, writes about the Stoics that way and is actually quite sympathetic to them in some ways before he rejects them in favor of skepticism. But anyway, that was the process of me following the breadcrumbs, Elizabeth. And then it just became a matter of, okay, I've got my question. And my question is, where is this form of Stoicism in the early modern era? Now I just need to read the literature and see if I can find it.
It's really helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, can I hop in? Sorry, I can't figure out the hand motion. I'm out of practice since we went back in person. Donovan, thanks for a wonderful presentation. As luck would have it, I was presenting on Hadot at Villanova this past weekend.
Wonderful. That's fantastic.
And actually, the way that his notion of the spiritual exercise in ancient philosophy helps us kind of recontextualize early patristic, and none of this is my area. I'm a philosopher who does 19th and 20th century German phenomenology, but I've got a bit of ancient philosophy. And anyway, looking at Tertullian and Justin, partly out of my teaching in Core and Honors, and how their debates with Stoicism are recontextualized if we understand these things to be discussions about ways of life and not merely a set of beliefs that we sort of hold abstractly. But I guess, and if this just isn't something you're interested in or have thought about, please feel free to say so. But you may know that there's sort of a resurgence of interest in Stoicism right now. And the parallel to the Renaissance sort of struck me. It's a sort of recovery of Stoicism in line with the values of a different age. Right. And so some of the other presentations on Hadot were sort of pushing back against kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of TikTok Stoicism. Yeah. And I've read a few of these books, and actually they're quite thoughtful, but they really do try to untether it from the sort of cosmic whole and the sort of deeper spiritual, if not quite confessional pagan, if you want, kind of commitments. So anyway, just curious if you see any parallels between the sort of contemporary engagement with Stoicism, but in view of a different set of questions in some ways, or a different loss of meaning, and parallel to the Renaissance one you're discussing here.
Good question. Stoicism is trendy, right? I mean, the Daily Stoic is a really popular podcast, and Bill Belichick says he's a Stoic, and Silicon Valley CEOs say that the clutch copies of Epictetus in board meetings. So it has become a funny. There's a very sanded down version of Stoicism, as you say, Greg,
Yeah.
that has become very popular. I think a lot of people who look, I don't want to sound snobbish and say like, oh, that's bad. People shouldn't engage with classical philosophy at all. And I encourage people to do so. I think, though, as you say, there is a way that glomming onto Stoicism as a kind of bumper sticker version of philosophy misses out, as you say, on the kind of radical cosmology that it has, right? Like a lot of people might claim that they love the Stoic idea of, a certain Stoic aphorism, right?
Sure, yeah.
About following reason or about not attending to that which we have no control over. I mean, that's the Serenity Prayer, which is directly adapted, right, from Stoics. But I don't know many people who are like, convinced that the world will renew itself out of flame every few centuries, or that the sort of the cosmic pneuma will that surrounds us as a kind of material gaseous spirituality is a fifth element. So it is certainly picked over and approximated in a way. But how does that compare to the Renaissance? Well, I think that it's almost like the same misunderstandings of Stoicism, but tacking the other way, so that now it's sort of taking Stoicism to be a kind of, I'm hesitant here to say, again, to sort of to be down on it, because I think it's wonderful, and in a way, it intentionally or not, it actually recuperates the therapeutic understanding of philosophy from the classical era that Nussbaum will seize on in The Therapy of Desire, and that this notion of philosophy as a way to live a good life. I mean, oftentimes that's sort of lost, I think, in contemporary understandings of philosophy. So for the other thing that maybe inadvertently is sort of great about it is the notion of the sententiae, or the phrases that one sort of looks at and meditates on, right? But I think that I can't speak to any one person in particular. I would just say that if anyone is interested in Stoicism and wants to know it in a sort of popular way and not feel intimidated by it, I think that there is like some work that goes into it too, that isn't that sort of I addressed in my talk, and that I think your conference, it sounds like, also dealt with, that isn't simply slap it on as the signature of your email and put it on as a Facebook status, but actually like really sit with it and take time out of your day to think through how your mind or soul is processing and taking in the natural world. That takes work, and it's hard, and I'm not great at it. But I think that that's the more profound way that one can have it reside in practice. But to your point about how it's like the Renaissance, I think as I'm speaking, I'm sort of realizing another thing is that oftentimes it's sort of approximated as a purely kind of textual philosophy, right? I mean, Seneca said, go live your life, Lucilius. Don't stop writing so much. That's not going to help you, which is jarring for an academic to hear. But I would just say, like, just think about Stoicism as you go through your day, and not you, Greg, you obviously know this, but to this anonymous person that we're addressing and haranguing, think about not just sit there and read through the text and take notes, but also like if you face a tough decision, think through your decision-making process, be mindful of it, like see how it can reside in practice. But I'm sure Ado, who was such a rigorous classicist, I'm sure he would be kind of rolling in the grave. I mean, he very famously had a respectful but quite critical engagement with Michel Foucault about his misuse of Stoicism in the history of sexuality, which that's another discussion. But that's such a great question, so I really appreciate that.
Maybe one quick follow-up,
Yeah,
if that's
course,
okay, Elizabeth. I'm struck. I might have been, I don't know, Frederick Copleston, the famous Oxford guy who did this huge history of philosophy. I think I got this comment from him, but he said, it may not be happenstance that Stoicism arises in the context of an empire, whereas Plato and Aristotle's philosophy arise in the context of the demos and the polis. And I wonder, I've often thought, even if it's in its sort of impure or adulterated forms today, if there's something about, the helplessness of one in the face of political and globalized structures that one feels they even if they participate in them, they can't influence to any large degree, that the sort of refocusing on the things that are in my control is attractive. And again, please don't feel the need to respond to this at length, but I wonder, is there something culturally in the Renaissance that parallels the sort of Greek Empire and modern globalization that would sort of lead to, I think of someone like Montaigne, this sort of focus on what lies within my control and the forms of self-expression that I can make meaningful because they're sort of mine, even if they're not participating in quote unquote the polis in the way ancient Greek philosophy envisioned it, or something like that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the Renaissance is in the wake of the Reformation, obviously, and I think still struggling in many ways with the times in which the plays that I'm studying are after, in England at least, after just such a tumultuous time in which the very succession of the nation and what the official religion of England sort of that pendulum swung back and forth so much that I believe in one person's generation they could have switched religions 4 times in order to adhere to the state religion and not risk getting literally in some cases burned at the stake. So I think that feeling of the sort of chaos at the top might encourage a way of finding a kind of solace amidst that that upheaval,
Yeah.
right? And I think but I should say too that there are people like Mary Beard, very famous classicist, who just flat out says like stop reading Aurelius, Marcus Aurelius, like he's horrible. He was this tyrannical emperor. Stop valorizing him through his like philosophical work and his meditations. And so there are, I think, remembering that historical scaffolding to Stoicism, that it does come out of a time in which politically we would find pretty abhorrent today, it is a useful reflection, I think, to have.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Nancy, would you like to ask the question that you had?
Sure, I guess it's that time. This is so interesting. And I just, Donovan, I was thinking, I love the way you bring in the plays and the quotes from the plays, and, just these playwrights like Shakespeare and Ben Jonson, who kind of always would look at Stoics in a certain way. And I was thinking about it in relation to the Reformation and Catholicism, and about the physical aspect of Stoicism. And I was
Yeah.
just wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit with regard to the idea of sacramentalism, like because it seems to me that the Stoic, the way you're describing it, like the sort of idea that the physical can be imbued with almost, you could say, holiness. It's not the same thing, but it to me seems like it could be very easily connected with the sacramental idea.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think you really get at the heart of why Stoicism was thought of as like, you can read these theological writers in the Renaissance wrestling in real time, saying like, wait, on the one hand, the Stoics are saying that there is no God and that God is just the sum totality of the world. We know that that's a really dangerous worldview. On the other hand, they are thinking through a kind of, as you say, a version of holiness in the everyday world. Now, when you think of the wake of the Reformation and there are many degrees of this, but certainly the idea of the Eucharist becoming, the material world in some ways becoming sapped of its material, of its holiness, of its grace, right? And so you have the famous altarpiece, or is rather frontispiece to a book by John Fox called Acts and Monuments. He was a Protestant martyrologist, and he has this beautiful image, kind of horrifying image, of all of these people stripping a church of the holy roots, of the crosses, and of the statuaries, and of all these things from the walls, and bringing them to a ship to take it away and sell it, right? And you get this there's a lovely moment I always teach my students in this writer named John Stowe, who in some ways was nostalgic for Catholicism, even though you couldn't be outright say that at the time. And he wrote something called the Survey of London, in which he literally walks through London, and he'll say, and now I shall turn onto this street, and I shall look to the left and see this old blacksmith shop and tell you about that. And he walks you through all of London, which is very helpful for cultural historians who want to learn about London at the time. And he has this beautiful moment where he sees a shop just like a store, and the sign, he realizes the sign is an old cross from a church that he'd gone to, and he's sort of, it's this melancholy moment as he's reminiscing about how this world is gone now, right? And now it's thought to be sort of heretical. And you get, it's not just that, of course, that the Protestants are now not Catholic. It's that there's virulent anti-Catholicism in which the Pope is thought to be the Antichrist and the coming of a kind of apocalyptic future, and in which Catholics are, hallucinating blood coming out of the of the body of Christ from the Eucharistic wafer, and so on, and so from the host, right, and so on and so forth. So I think Stoicism, in some ways, is both like proto-Catholic, which would be very dangerous at the time, and at the same time, kind of animistic almost, right? Which recalls for me, Nancy, and this is not my area of expertise, but when I teach St. Francis in the honors course, Francis had to appear before the Pope and basically say, no, I'm legit, right? And he gets gets a pass, and it becomes, an incredibly profoundly influential sect of Catholicism. Whereas on the other hand, someone like Wycliffe, right, or the Lollards are deemed heretical. But what Francis was proposing, what seemed dangerous to me, and again, this is not an area of my expertise, so I'd love to hear from others, is that in his hymn to the sun and to the natural world and his dependence upon nature, it could be mistaken for a kind of animism and sort of paganism, in which he's actually literally saying, like, I'm worshiping this tree, right, and I'm worshiping this bird, rather than seeing God's beauty in that creation. And so that's always been a kind of razor thin line, right? And so you get these figures who just dance on the edge of what might be thought of as heretical ideas, but are actually kind of expressions of faith. And that, I think, kind of anticipates that same duality that Stoicism has in the wake of the Reformation. So I know I veered away from the Reformation there, but hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
No, I think that's really, really, really interesting. I just know that because our time is just about up, I really have to have more conversations with you about this. I'm thinking of, like you're connecting it with performance and theater, and I don't know, you probably don't even remember this, but my second book was about Catholic literature and film, and just the sacramental aspect of that, and I just think there's a real connection there that I'd love to talk to you more about.
Yeah, there's a book, I don't know if you've heard it, called Movies or Prayers by Josh Larson. That's a similar kind of idea. Anyway, and he just wrote a book on Christianity and horror.
I'll have to check that out, because I just think that when I was listening to it, I was thinking that this is sort of like what really interested me. Now, obviously, film is a much later genre and all that. It's not the same thing, but there is something connecting there. So, does anybody have anything else they'd like to say to our wonderful guest speaker? I mean, that was so enjoyable, Donovan.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad that those fragments all kind of wove together into something holistic, because I really wanted to do a lot. Rather than just concentrate on like one section of the book, which I thought might get a little too in the weeds, right? So I just kind of danced around. So I'm glad that hopefully constellated into something that made sense.
Thank you so much. And
you.
You may, like, as I mentioned, there are students who, watch this. I have one student particularly, was very eager to get the recording from the last time we did this. And, so if we do get questions from students or anyone like that, is it all right if we?
Absolutely. Please send them my way. I'd love to further this discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Elizabeth, for your introduction to Donovan. And, our next presenter is going to be Dermot Quinn. Of the history department. I can send everybody, and once you get on this list, Donovan we'll send you our little posting and stuff. And we'll let you, it's coming up in, I don't have the date in front of me, but, I'll send that to everybody. That's coming up in about a month.
Wonderful.
So have a great,
thanks, Donovan. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Maribel.
Take care. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.